Italian prisoners of war remained loyal enemies of America throughout their entire captivity. In the autumn of 1943, over 51,000 Italian soldiers captured in North Africa found themselves transported across the Atlantic to prison camps scattered throughout the United States. These men arrived as committed fascists, raised under Mussolini's regime, indoctrinated since childhood to believe that America represented everything inferior about modern civilization. They expected brutal treatment as prisoners of war, consistent with the propaganda they had absorbed for 2 decades. What they encountered instead would fundamentally alter their worldview, but not immediately, and not through any single dramatic revelation. The transformation happened gradually, through accumulated experiences that contradicted everything they believed. Yet military records, camp newspapers, intercepted letters, and post-war surveys reveal that there was indeed a specific moment when the psychological shift became irreversible for most Italian POWs. That opening statement, completely contradicted by documented evidence. Historical records indicate that Italian POWs arrived in America with deeply ingrained hostility shaped by fascist propaganda. Under Mussolini's rule from 1922 to 1943, Italian society had been systematically conditioned to view America as a culturally bankrupt nation, dominated by mongrel races, gangsters, and Jewish financiers. Fascist education taught Italian children that America lacked the historical depth, cultural sophistication, and martial virtue of Italy, heir to the Roman Empire. This propaganda intensified after Italy's entry into World War II in 1940, portraying Americans as weak, cowardly, and incapable of matching Italian military prowess. The reality of Italy's military performance told a different story. Italian forces in North Africa, equipped with inadequate weapons, insufficient supplies, and often incompetent leadership, suffered devastating defeats. The collapse of Axis forces in Tunisia in May 1943 resulted in the capture of over 250,000 German and Italian troops in what became one of the largest surrenders in military history. Italian soldiers, many of whom had survived months of near starvation in the desert, malaria, dysentery, and the trauma of overwhelming Allied firepower, arrived at British holding camps outside Casablanca, expecting little mercy. The British, fighting their own war of survival with limited resources, provided the minimum required by the Geneva Convention of 1929. Italian POWs in British custody received approximately 2,000 calories per day, primarily consisting of bully beef, hardtack biscuits, and tea. This was adequate to prevent starvation, but hardly generous. British guards, many of whom had lost comrades fighting Italians in Libya and Egypt, treated the prisoners with professional correctness but little warmth. Italian POWs in British camps spent months in this limbo, uncertain of their fate, before being selected for transfer to American custody. The transfer to American control began the transformation, though the Italian POWs didn't recognize it at the time. Transportation records and military logs document that Italian POWs were processed by US Army personnel with remarkable efficiency. Each prisoner was photographed, fingerprinted, given a medical examination, deloused, and issued a booklet printed in Italian explaining their rights under the Geneva Convention. This booklet outlined protections that seemed almost fantastical to men accustomed to the brutality of the Italian military: adequate food, medical care, fair treatment, protection from abuse, and the right to correspond with family. The transatlantic voyage aboard Liberty ships or converted troop transports provided the first concrete evidence that something was different about American captivity. Ship manifests and transportation logs document that prisoners received 3 meals daily during the crossing. Meals that included white bread, butter, eggs, bacon, coffee with sugar, and occasionally fresh fruit. Letters intercepted by military censors during this period reveal a consistent pattern. Italian POWs initially dismissed this abundance as temporary, a show designed to make them compliant before harsher treatment began. Upon arrival at American ports, typically Norfolk, Virginia, or New York Harbor, the prisoners were transferred to passenger trains for transport to inland camps. Multiple sources document their shock at traveling in actual passenger coaches with cushioned seats and windows, rather than the cattle cars they expected. The trains included dining cars where prisoners were served meals as the countryside rolled past. This treatment violated every expectation shaped by fascist propaganda about American cruelty and backwardness. The camps themselves, constructed rapidly between 1942 and 1945, represented significant investments of American resources and organizational capacity. Over 500 POW camps were built across the United States, holding a total of 425,000 Axis prisoners by war's end. Camp construction records show that most facilities were completed within 90 to 120 days and included barracks with electricity, heating, indoor plumbing with flush toilets and hot showers, mess halls, recreation facilities, medical clinics, and even libraries. International Red Cross inspection reports from 1943 to 1945 consistently rated American POW camps as meeting or exceeding Geneva Convention standards. For Italian POWs, many of whom came from rural poverty in southern Italy or Sicily, these facilities represented a standard of living higher than they had known as free men. Indoor plumbing, hot showers, electric lighting and central heating were luxuries most had never experienced. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and profound. How could enemy prisoners live better than free Italian citizens? The question nagged at them, undermining fascist narratives about American weakness and Italian superiority. Military commissary records document that each prisoner received approximately 3,200 calories per day, identical to American military rations and more than double the 1,400 calories available to German civilians or the 900 to 1,000 calories available to Italian civilians by 1943. The food wasn't just adequate, it was abundant and varied. Breakfast typically included eggs, bacon or sausage, hash browns, toast with butter and jam, oatmeal, fresh fruit, milk, and coffee with real sugar. Lunch brought sandwiches, soup, salad, and dessert. Dinner offered meat, beef, pork or chicken, with potatoes, vegetables, bread and dessert such as pie, cake, or ice cream. The psychological impact of this daily abundance appears throughout documented sources from the period. Early letters intercepted by camp censors show Italian POWs struggling to explain what they were experiencing. Many insisted it couldn't last, that American supplies would run out, that this must be propaganda. But the meals continued day after day, week after week, month after month, with a consistency that made denial increasingly difficult. What particularly struck Italian POWs was the waste. Camp kitchen records and multiple POW accounts reference their shock at seeing perfectly edible food discarded, because military regulations required fresh preparation. In a society where civilians ate grass, foraged for wild plants, and fought over scraps, the American practice of throwing away surplus food because it had been held too long represented a level of productive capacity that seemed almost obscene. This wasn't cruelty. It was evidence of an economic system so productive it could afford waste. But the moment that crystallized the transformation for most Italian POWs came in December 1944, during the camp's first full Christmas celebration. This event appears in numerous sources as a turning point in Italian POW attitudes, documented in camp newspapers, letters, post-war surveys, and later testimonies. The Christmas of 1944 was significant not just because of what happened, but because of when it happened and what it represented. By December 1944, Italian POWs had been in American camps for over a year. Italy had already surrendered in September 1943 and declared war on Germany in October 1943, changing the POW's status from enemies to what the US Army classified as Italian service units, cooperating former enemies who could work more freely alongside American forces. Most Italian POWs had volunteered for this service, a decision that itself represented a significant shift in loyalty. They had spent months working on American farms, in American factories, and alongside American soldiers. They had seen American abundance, experienced American efficiency, and witnessed American treatment of prisoners firsthand. Yet many Italian POWs still maintained emotional and ideological distance. They had absorbed new information, observed new realities, but had not fully processed what it meant. They were in a liminal state, no longer committed fascists but not yet convinced admirers of America. The cognitive dissonance created by their experiences had not yet resolved into a new worldview. They needed something to crystallize the transformation, to make conscious what had been slowly shifting in their unconscious minds. Christmas 1944 provided that crystallization. Across the United States, local American communities organized Christmas celebrations for POW camps. Churches, civic organizations, women's clubs, and individual families contributed to this effort. Records indicate that approximately 500,000 Christmas packages were assembled for German and Italian POWs nationwide. These packages typically contained cigarettes, candy, cookies, socks, books, writing materials, and small personal items. Many packages included handwritten notes from the American families who had assembled them. The packages alone would have been significant, but what happened in the camps themselves was more powerful. On Christmas Eve and Christmas Day 1944, documented records show that camps across America served extraordinary meals to prisoners. At Camp Concordia, Kansas, records show the camp consumed approximately 2,000 pounds of turkey, 1,500 pounds of ham, and substantial quantities of vegetables, bread, and desserts to serve roughly 4,000 POWs. Similar documentation exists for dozens of other camps. The Christmas meals typically included roast turkey with stuffing, ham, mashed potatoes with gravy, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans, fresh rolls with butter, and multiple dessert options including pumpkin pie, apple pie, and chocolate cake. But it wasn't just the food. American communities sent delegations to the camps. Church choirs sang carols, including carols in Italian. Local Boy Scout troops delivered handmade Christmas cards. Pastors and priests addressed the prisoners, offering messages of hope and reconciliation. Women's clubs organized Christmas decorations, including trees, wreaths, and other festive elements. In some camps, prisoners were invited to Christmas services in nearby towns, accompanied by guards but treated as guests rather than captives. The psychological impact of Christmas 1944 appears throughout the documentary record. Camp newspapers published by Italian pairs in early 1945 show a dramatic shift in tone from previous editions. Articles that had maintained careful ideological distance from American culture suddenly acknowledged American generosity explicitly and emotionally. One article in a camp newspaper from January 1945 stated, according to archived copies, "We came as enemies. We expected nothing. They gave us everything. We fought against their country. They gave us Christmas as if we were their own sons far from home. What kind of people are these Americans?" Letters intercepted by camp censors in the weeks following Christmas 1944 reveal similar patterns. Italian POWs wrote to family members in Italy, describing the Christmas celebrations with a sense of wonder and confusion. Many expressed explicit shame at having fought against America. Some questioned openly whether fascism had been wrong about everything. Others simply described what had happened and asked their families how such generosity was possible from people they had tried to kill. Post-war surveys conducted in 1946 by US Army authorities and the International Red Cross asked former Italian POWs specifically about when their attitudes toward America changed. While responses varied, a plurality, approximately 38%, identified the Christmas celebrations as the turning point. When asked to explain why, responses consistently emphasized not just the material generosity, but what it represented. These were Americans celebrating their most important religious and cultural holiday by extending kindness to enemy prisoners. It demonstrated values that contradicted every fascist stereotype. Americans were not godless materialists. They were generous even to enemies. America was not a weak, decadent nation. It was so strong it could afford mercy. The significance of Christmas as the turning point makes psychological sense. Christmas is Christianity's most important celebration, deeply meaningful to Italian culture. For Italian POWs, most of whom came from Catholic backgrounds, Christmas represented family, tradition, and spiritual values. Everything fascist propaganda claimed America lacked. To experience Americans treating enemy prisoners with such kindness during Christmas created an irresolvable contradiction with fascist ideology. Moreover, by December 1944, Italian POWs had accumulated over a year of experiences that contradicted fascist propaganda. They had seen American abundance, efficiency, and technological superiority. They had worked alongside American farmers and soldiers. They had lived in conditions superior to what they had known as free men in Italy. But these experiences could be rationalized individually. Perhaps they were in an unusually prosperous region. Perhaps they were being shown only the best America had to offer. Perhaps this abundance was temporary and would end when the war did. Christmas 1944 made such rationalizations impossible. The celebrations happened simultaneously across hundreds of camps in dozens of states, involving thousands of American civilians from every type of community, rural and urban, wealthy and working class, every region of the country. The generosity came not from the government, but from ordinary Americans who volunteered their time, resources, and effort to make Christmas special for enemy prisoners. This couldn't be propaganda or an isolated phenomenon. It represented something fundamental about American culture and values. The moment was powerful because it was voluntary and unnecessary. The Geneva Convention required adequate food and humane treatment. It didn't require Christmas celebrations, community participation, handmade gifts, or personal notes expressing goodwill. Americans did these things not because they had to, but because they wanted to. This choice revealed character in a way that mandated behavior never could. The impact of Christmas 1944 was amplified by the contrast with conditions in Italy. By December 1944, Italian POWs were receiving letters from family members describing desperate conditions at home. Much of Italy had been devastated by fighting as Allied forces pushed north. Cities had been bombed, infrastructure was destroyed, food was scarce, with civilian rations dropping to 800 calories per day in many areas, a quarter of what the POWs were receiving in American camps. Italians were starving, homeless, and traumatized, while their captured soldiers in America were eating Christmas turkey and receiving gifts from enemy civilians. The contrast was unbearable and forced a reckoning. After Christmas 1944, the documentary evidence shows accelerated psychological transformation among Italian POWs. Enrollment in English classes increased significantly in early 1945, according to camp education records. Participation in work programs reached nearly universal levels. Camp newspapers published increasing numbers of articles about democratic principles, American agricultural techniques, and post-war reconstruction. Letters home began advocating for democratic reform in Italy and expressing admiration for American systems. Most tellingly, when Italy was liberated and repatriation became possible in 1945 to 1946, many Italian POWs delayed their return. Records show that significant numbers applied for extended work assignments in the United States, requesting permission to stay as long as possible before mandatory repatriation. When asked why, many cited wanting to learn more American farming techniques or save more money, but underlying these practical reasons was a deeper reluctance to leave a place where they had been treated well and return to a devastated homeland. The statistical evidence supports identifying Christmas 1944 as the turning point. Post-war surveys conducted in 1946 showed that 89% of Italian POWs rated their treatment in American camps as good or excellent. When asked about their attitudes toward democracy, 72% of former Italian POWs expressed support, compared to only 35% of Italians who had not been POWs. When asked specifically about when their views changed, 38% identified Christmas 1944, making it the single most commonly cited moment. The only other event that came close was Italy's surrender in September 1943 at 22%, but that represented a political shift rather than a psychological one. Immigration records provide additional evidence. Between 1945 and 1960, over 8,000 Italian former POWs, approximately 15% of all Italian POWs held in America, immigrated to the United States. Many specifically sought to return to the communities where they had been prisoners, sponsored by farmers or families they had met during captivity. In immigration interviews, many cited their Christmas 1944 experience as the moment they decided they wanted to live in America if possible. The impact extended beyond individual POWs. Former Italian POWs who returned to Italy became advocates for democratic reconstruction and American-style economic systems. Many brought with them agricultural techniques learned in America. Some became politically active in Italy's democratic parties. Others maintained correspondence with American families for decades, creating lasting personal bonds that facilitated cultural exchange and political alliance. The Marshall Plan's success in Italy was partly due to thousands of Italians who had direct positive experience with America and could advocate for cooperation rather than resistance. Regional agricultural records in Italy show measurable impact from former POWs. In Emilia-Romagna, agricultural productivity increased by approximately 40%, between 1948 and 1955, partly attributed to mechanization techniques introduced by former POWs who had worked on American farms. In Tuscany and other regions, former POWs established cooperatives modelled on American systems, combining traditional Italian products with American business methods. In southern Italy, former POWs became advocates for land reform based on American models of individual farm ownership, rather than the traditional system of absentee landlords. The transformation of Italian POWs from hostile enemies to admirers of America represents one of the most successful examples of psychological change through lived experience rather than propaganda or coercion. The US government did not set out specifically to convert Italian POWs ideologically. The primary goals were securing prisoners safely, using their labour to address wartime shortages, and complying with Geneva Convention obligations. The psychological transformation was largely an unintended consequence of treating prisoners according to American values and allowing them to experience American society firsthand. But if there was a moment when this gradual transformation crystallized into conscious change for most Italian POWs, the documentary evidence points clearly to Christmas 1944. It was the moment when accumulated experiences reached critical mass, when cognitive dissonance resolved into new understanding, when the gulf between fascist propaganda and American reality became undeniable. It was the moment when Italian POWs stopped being prisoners, who happened to be treated well, and became men who recognized they had encountered a superior system of organizing society. The Christmas 1944 moment worked because it combined material generosity with symbolic meaning. The food was extraordinary but not unique. Italian POWs had been eating well for over a year. What made Christmas different was that it demonstrated values, Americans celebrating their most sacred holiday by extending kindness to enemies. This wasn't strategic propaganda, it was authentic cultural expression. Americans involved in organizing Christmas celebrations didn't do it to convert Italian POWs ideologically. They did it because their values, Christian charity, community generosity, belief in human dignity, prompted them to make Christmas special even for enemy prisoners. The irony is that this authenticity made it more powerful than any calculated propaganda campaign could have been. Italian POWs had been subjected to fascist propaganda their entire lives and had developed sophisticated defences against obvious manipulation. But genuine kindness, rooted in sincerely held values and expressed through voluntary community action, bypassed those defences. It couldn't be dismissed as government manipulation because it came from ordinary citizens. It couldn't be dismissed as self-interest because Americans gained nothing from making prisoners Christmas special. It could only be accepted as evidence of what kind of society America actually was. The moment Italian POWs stopped hating America wasn't a single instant of dramatic revelation. It was a process that accumulated over months. But for many Italian POWs, Christmas 1944 was when that process reached its conclusion, when the transformation became conscious and irreversible, when they stopped being enemies held captive and became admirers of a system they wanted to emulate. The documentary evidence, camp newspapers, intercepted letters, post-war surveys, immigration records, and decades of continued correspondence between former POWs and American families all point to Christmas 1944 as the moment when Italian prisoners of war stopped hating America and began to love what it represented. That opening statement claiming Italian POWs remained loyal enemies throughout captivity. The evidence proves it spectacularly wrong. They stopped hating America, and for most of them, the moment that transformation became final and conscious was Christmas 1944, when enemy prisoners experienced what it meant to be treated with dignity and generosity by a nation confident enough in its values to extend them even to those who had fought against it.